Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Aparuta te sangamata sadwara yeso davanto pamanchantu sadhanti. Okay, so welcome back everybody for our final session discussion of Kamma and Rebirth in early Buddhism. And so far we've had a review of some of the basic teachings on Kamma and Rebirth. We've discussed some of the myths and perceptions that people have about it, and we've seen that some of those myths have some basis in what the Buddha taught and some don't. We looked at some of the suttas that dealing with the basic principles of Kamma and Rebirth, and we've looked at some of the evidence for the idea that rebirth is a reality and not just a myth or something that's found in the ancient textbooks. So what I'd like to do in this final session is to try to sort of pull all those things together and try to integrate these teachings in an understanding of the Dhamma as a whole, so that we can see that these teachings on Kamma and Rebirth are not something, it's not just something which is kind of added on to the Dhamma, it's not something which is just sort of arbitrary, it doesn't just, it's not something you can kind of bolt on or take off the Dhamma, but it's inherent to the very pattern of how the Dhamma is felt and experienced and structured. So, think back to these ideas that we were talking about earlier in the discussion. We were talking about how Kamma is about people's choices. It's about what you choose to do, and it's about taking responsibility for your actions. And so it's essentially about cause and effect, right? You do a good act, with good result. You do a bad act, there's bad result. So cause and effect, connection, but also energies, right? So this is how our world works, right? Our world works as energies. Everything we look around us is just energies. And even though to our ordinary senses that objects appear to be solid, we know from our understanding of modern physics that this is not the case, that what seems to be solid is actually just energies whirling through space. And that even solid matter actually is almost all made up of space. It's actually all just empty, and all there is energies moving through space. Energies changing so fast. And so this world that we live in is incredibly dynamic and incredibly empty. There's nothing else other than energies moving through space. And these teachings that the Buddha was talking about so many years ago, teachings of impermanence, and teachings of conditionality, teachings of emptiness, these things are so in tune with that modern scientific understanding of how the world is actually made up. So the Buddha's teachings on consciousness, on how the mind works, is very much a part of this worldview. So just as all of the physical things around us are made up of energies which are changing all the time, our minds too are nothing other than energies which are moving and changing all of the time. Conditioned energies. And so this is one of the core of one of the Buddha's most profound teachings, was the insight into what he called not self. Now if we want to understand the Buddha's teachings of not self, then we have to first of all understand what is a self. Okay? And to understand what a self is, we have to again take a little bit of a journey back and look at some of the historical context. Because when the Buddha is referring to not self, he's not meaning a self in the same way that we usually talk about it these days. Okay? So what he's referring to primarily is the Brahmanical concept of the Atman. Also you find similar concept in Jainism. They have what they call a jiva, and in different places they have different ideas. But the basic idea similarity between all of these things is that there's some kind of permanent, eternal essence, which is who you really are. And now that essence is maybe conceived in different ways or described in different ways in different traditions and so on. But basically, this is the idea. And when the Buddha was talking about not self, this is what he meant. He meant that there's no thing, there's no solid essence, which is what you can say that this is who you are, that remains unchanging through all time. And so the Buddha gave a whole range of tests for us to reflect and investigate and inquire within ourselves as to whether this really is the case. You say, well, if you think of yourself as being feelings, then look inside, investigate, inquire your feelings. You'll find that your feelings are always changing. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad, sometimes it's a neutral feeling. If yourself is feeling, then how come your feeling changes? How come, does that mean yourself was once there and then yourself is not there? Doesn't really make sense. So he gave these methods of investigating and inquiring to be able to let go of this illusion of the self. Now, so this is a Buddhist teaching on not self. And one of the things which people very often come up with, and they see an incompatibility between the teaching of not self and the teaching of rebirth. And they say, if there really is no self, how can you get reborn? Right? If there's no self, who is it that gets reborn? How can you get reborn if there's no self? Actually, that's not the problem. The real problem is, how can you get reborn if there is a self? That is the actual problem. Why? Because rebirth is a process of change. Right? It's inherent in the nature of rebirth that it's changing. Right? One life is different from another life. But a self is supposed to be the same. If the Atman is really eternal, how come the Atman always gets involved with these lives which are changing all of the time? Actually, this is one of the basic problems with Hindu philosophy. And interestingly enough, in the centuries following the Buddha, some of the Brahmanical philosophers came and actually revised their teaching on rebirth and so on, and they actually, in a sense, agreed with the Buddha's teaching and said, yes, it's true that the process of rebirth is actually not self. Okay? They said there is a self, but it's not what gets reborn. Right? And they realize, actually, this is true. Rebirth can't involve a self, because rebirth is a process of change, and the self is something which is static. Okay? So, from our point of view, a modern point of view, how do we understand the process of rebirth? We understand it in terms of a flow of energy. The Buddha talked about a vijnana sota, literally a stream of consciousness. Okay? He also used this other phrase, samvadanika vijnana, it's like an evolving consciousness. So this is the idea that the consciousness is moving and changing. Let me read a little bit from one of the suttas that talks about this issue. And this is from Majjhima Nikaya number 38, the Mahatanha Sankhaya Sutta, the great discourse on the ending of craving. So, in this discourse had a monk called Sati, the fisherman's son. This is Sati with a long A, not Sati as in mindfulness. So he says to the Buddha, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, it is this very same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. Okay, tadeva vijnana. Okay, this very same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. And so this is the pernicious wrong view of Sati. And see how this is different from the Buddha's view, right? The Buddha's view is that what gets reborn is this conditioned consciousness, okay? This consciousness which is changing, which is never the same. Sati is saying it's the same consciousness which gets reborn. And then the Buddha asked him, what is that consciousness, Sati? And he says, Venerable Sir, it is that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions. Okay, so consciousness is that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions. And the Buddha's response, misguided man, to whom have you ever known me to teach the Dhamma in this way? Have I not stated in many ways consciousness to be dependently arisen, since without a condition there is no origination of consciousness? But you, misguided man, have misrepresented us by your wrong grasp and injured yourself and stored up much demerit, for this will lead to your harm and suffering for a long time. And then the Buddha said to the monks, monks, what do you think? Has this Bhikkhu Sati, the son of a fisherman, kindled even a spark of wisdom in this Dhamma and Vinaya? And the monk said, how could he, Venerable Sir? No, Venerable Sir. When this was said, the Bhikkhu Sati, son of a fisherman, sat silent, dismayed, with his shoulders drooping and his head down, glum and without response. Poor old Sati, you've got to feel a bit sorry for, you don't? It must be Pretty harsh to be criticized by the Buddha like that, right, in public. I mean, but it's the Buddha, right? Imagine if the Buddha said that to you, you foolish person, you don't even have a spark of wisdom. My goodness. So the Buddha obviously felt that this was a serious misrepresentation of his views, okay? So hopefully you can see the difference between these two concepts. On the surface, they sound like they're kind of similar, right? They're both talking about consciousness or vijnana as being involved in that process of rebirth, right? So it sounds like it's quite similar, but there's a fundamental distinction. So for Sati, consciousness was an entity, right? It's that same entity which is going from one life to the next, and it's that entity which speaks and feels and experiences the result of good and bad action, right? And the Buddha says, no, this is not how it is. It's not an entity, it's not a thing, it's a process. It's an energy, it's evolving, it's conditioned, okay? And this is what the teaching of dependent origination is about. It's about a flow of energy. So how are we to understand that? What kind of image can we use, or metaphor can we use to try to make sense of this and understand the difference between them? Well, the metaphor which I like to use is the metaphor of the fax machine. Now this was originally a contemporary metaphor, but now is an old-fashioned metaphor because fax machines no longer exist. But anyway, for those of you who remember what fax machines were, it's still a good metaphor. You can change it into emails or something if you like, but faxes actually work a bit better for this one, so I'll keep it as a fax machine for now. Okay, how does it work? Right, you want to send a fax. You get a sheet of paper. Put it in the fax machine. The fax machine scans that piece of paper, makes it an image of that, and converts that image into some kind of digital information. Okay, so you converted the visual representation on that paper, okay, has been converted into digital information, to binary code, right? Then you contact the other fax machine that you're sending it to, right? That information is transferred from one machine to another. The binary code is transferred. Ultimately, is what it is. It's just ones and zeros, on and off. Yeah. Now, important to understand that when you send electricity down a wire, right, there's nothing actually moves from one point to another. Okay, there's not like there's a blob of electricity in one place that goes the way to the other way. Okay, it's just that there's a pattern of potentials. Okay, so these potential energies going on and off, right, and those patterns replicate themselves down the wire. Okay, so there's a shifting of a pattern, but there's no thing which moves. Patterns of energies, right? This is what sankharas are. This is what a kamma is, patterns of energies. So when that pattern of energy, right, arrives at the other end, then it's represented in digital formats, transformed, it's put into a printer which decodes it and then prints out the next piece of paper, the fax, with the same message that was on the previous one. Now, nothing, no physical thing, not one single atom has moved from this place to that place, right? There's no physical connection between them at all, right? And yet, but also interesting that the printout, okay, is always going to be different. One is different from the other. It's never exactly the same. Like the colour's a bit different. It's got some splotches and marks. It's never reproduced with 100% accuracy. Yeah? But the message is still the same. The meaning of the words on that fax are still exactly the same as the meaning of the words on the original one. Right? So that meaning has transferred, yeah? Even though nothing physical has changed. That is how rebirth happens. Okay? This is what's going on in that process. So what is that meaning of that information is all of those things that matter to us in our life. Our memories, our Kamma, our intentions, our personality, our behaviour, all of those things that make up who we are or who we think that we are. And all of those things are a kind of energy, patterns of energy, right? Just think about this idea of patterns of energy repeating themselves, right? That's what's going on in your mind when you're thinking. Yeah? Look at how your thinking process goes, right? You remember something that happened in your past, you go over it, you identify with that person that you're representing in your memory. You're making those patterns of energies. Those patterns of energies, those thoughts, are in some way associated with your brain, right? They're connected with your brain and with this particular physical organic thing, but that's not a necessary or essential connection, okay? It's like software on a computer. It can manifest in different forms. So this fax comes out, different physical entity, completely different, and yet the same energy, the same meaning of the message. Okay? Now that's the Buddhist theory of dependent origination, how rebirth takes place through these processes of energies, as opposed to the theory of a soul or an Atma. So how does the theory of a soul or an Atma explain that process? Well, the theory of a soul says that inside your fax machine there lives a little man. He's the size of your thumb. And when you put the fax machine in there, he reads your fax and he memorizes all of the words in that fax. And then when you press go on the fax, he runs down the telephone line very, very fast to get to the other fax machine. And then he gets the other piece of paper and he writes out the message. Yeah? And that's how faxes work. Right? That's a soul theory. Right? And so this is why the soul theory actually doesn't explain anything at all. It sounds like it explains things, but all it does is just make some kind of imaginary figure which we've made kind of like a person, right? A soul is kind of like a person, but kind of not. And that somehow explains it. It doesn't explain anything, right? What explains it is a Buddhist explanation of saying that this is processes, the sankharas, right? The sankharas are patterns of energy which change and replicate themselves, okay? So this is essentially what our kamma is. Now, in the Buddhist teaching, this tends to be framed in two different ways. Okay, so for these sessions, we've been talking about kamma. We've been using the Pali word kamma, and we've been talking about kamma in the sense of leading to a good rebirth or a bad rebirth, and so on and so forth. So this is essentially an ethical teaching. Okay, so kamma is an ethical teaching. The other term which the Buddha used very often is the word sankhara. Okay, another Pali word has basically the same meaning as the word kamma. It's the same root and also defined as intention. Kamma is defined as intention. Sankhara is also defined as intention. Basically, they mean the same thing, but they're used in slightly different contexts. Whereas kamma is usually used in an ethical context, right, to talk about good and bad, living a good life, avoiding bad, getting a good rebirth, and so on. Sankhara is usually talked about in a philosophical or an existential context. It's talking about making an end of rebirth, how we can get beyond rebirth altogether. So sankhara, you might say, is more of a technical term or more of a philosophical term, whereas kamma is an ethical term, talking about good and bad choices. So the key teaching which the Buddha gives on all this for talking about how rebirth happens is a teaching on dependent origination. Okay, and so that's already been mentioned here in the teaching to Sati, the fisherman's son. Dependent origination, paticca samuppada. And of course, paticca samuppada is quite rightly regarded as one of the most profound, both on one hand quite difficult teaching, but also very powerful teaching for understanding many of the different aspects of the Dhamma. But one of the important aspects of the Dhamma that dependent origination explains is how does rebirth happen without a soul? Now, one of the things that we see, unfortunately, in modern times is this teaching on dependent origination is often reinterpreted and I think misinterpreted to be kind of a general teaching of conditionality and interdependence, and it's kind of divorced from the context of rebirth and becomes, purely a psychological teaching. And I think that's a bit of a shame, and I think that does a disservice to the teaching of dependent origination. Of course, we can look at psychological questions, even social questions, environmental questions, all kinds of things in terms of dependent origination, right? Of course, these things are interrelated, they are conditioned, and that's a perfectly valid way to look at it. But that's not what the Buddha was talking about with his teaching on dependent origination. The main teaching on dependent origination is there in order to understand how rebirth happens, okay, and how this process of rebirth happens without a soul. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a bit more of a look at this Mahatanha Sankhaya Sutta and look at some of the other aspects of dependent origination as described here. The first thing that we're going to have a look at is this notion of consciousness. Okay. Now, when we use this word consciousness, what are we referring to? Sometimes it can be quite vague and so on. I mentioned before that the Buddha was talking responding to an Upanishadic tradition. Now, in the Upanishads, we find that consciousness is treated as something which becomes a highly metaphysical concept. Okay, so in the Upanishads, we find the phrase like this: "Avijnana gahanameva" is a sheer mass of consciousness, and so it's this idea that everything in the world is. We see all this diversity in the world, right? We see different people, we see trees, we see animals, we see shapes and mountains and things, and all of these things we see in the world, they all have their different names and concepts which are attached to them, okay? There's the diversity and multiplicity of things. But for somebody who's enlightened, all that multiplicity disappears and all we have is that ocean of consciousness, vijnana gahanameva. And the metaphor is used that it's like all the rivers which flow down to the ocean. And just as each river has its own individual name and its own individual shape, but when they flow together into the great ocean, they will all lose their names and their shapes, and they're just known as the great ocean. Okay? This is the Upanishadic teaching, right? This is the idea that Atman, that soul, is somehow immanent in everything. So the entire cosmos is really just an expression of our own Atman. And this is how the Upanishads, particularly the Upanishadic sage called Ajahn, this is how he dealt with the idea of consciousness. And so the Buddha talked about these things in a way that was explicitly meant to critique this Upanishadic view and to talk about consciousness in an entirely new way. And how did he do that? Monks, consciousness is reckoned by the particular condition dependent on which it arises. Okay? The particular condition dependent on which it arises. When consciousness arises dependent on the eye and forms, it is reckoned as eye consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the ear and sounds, it is reckoned as ear consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the nose and odors, is nose consciousness. On the tongue and flavours is tongue consciousness. On the body and tangibles, it's reckoned as body consciousness. When it arises dependent on the mind and mind objects, it is reckoned as mind consciousness. Okay? So this is deconstructing that whole Upanishadic view that there's just this one thing which is consciousness. Okay? So there's no unitary single thing which is consciousness, but consciousness is conditioned. Now, this is what our experience is, right? So we take this teaching, apply it in your own mind, your own experience, right? As you're sitting there, you realise, actually, what do you see, right? What is your visual consciousness like? Yeah? You should look out through your eyes. You realise that, actually, that has a particular kind of quality to it, doesn't it, right? Sight has a particular quality. You know, for example, it's kind of oval-shaped, right? You can see in front of yourself, you've got a field like this, and you see different colours and depth and so on within that, and it has its own particular quality, which is what we call eye consciousness, okay? But then as you're listening to me speak, you can also hear that ear consciousness, right? Sound. And that's a completely different kind of thing than sight consciousness, right? And normally we don't notice that, right? Normally our experience is all just mixed up, right? We can say, I saw a movie, right? And when you're sitting there, you're seeing things and you're hearing things, and it's all mixed up, but it's just like one experience, right? So this is one of the things that we can do in meditation, is because we simplify our mind, we clarify our experience, and we can see the difference between seeing and hearing. You realise there's no one thing which is consciousness. There are these two very different kinds of things. Similarly, nose consciousness, tongue, body, and the mind. They're all very, very different kinds of things. One of the memorable similes that's given by the Buddha on this is called the Chapana simile, the six animals. Where he said that our six senses is like if you get, and I can't remember what all the animals are now, you get a bird and a snake and a dog and a crocodile and a horse and all of these different animals, and you tie them up together, right? And you tie them in one bundle and then you leave them to it, right? This is what our senses are like. It's all these completely different things. And of course our mind is the one that sits in the middle. And our mind makes sense of all these things and turns it into one unitary experience. Yeah. So this is how consciousness works. So the Buddha goes on to say, just as if a fire burns dependent on logs, it's called log fire. If it burns on grass, it's called a grouse fire. If it's burned on cow dung, then it's cow dung fire. If it burns on rubbish, it's a rubbish fire. So to consciousness, it rises dependent on the specific condition. Okay? So this is against that idea that consciousness is some kind of unconditioned reality. Again, I won't go through, we don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of the teachings here in... So the Buddha goes on to make some interesting points to the monks in this discussion. Talks about the whole of dependent origination, and then says, knowing and seeing in this way, would you run back to the past, thinking, were we in the past? Were we not in the past? What were we in the past? How were we in the past? Having been what did we become in the past? No, Bhante. Knowing and seeing in this way, would you run forward to the future, thus thinking, shall we be in the future? Shall we not be in the future? What shall we be in the future? How shall we be in the future? Having been what? What shall we become in the future? No, Bhante. Knowing and seeing in this way, would you now be inwardly perplexed about the present? Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? Where is this being come from? Where will it all go? No, Bhante. So this is a very powerful passage, right? These are the kind of doubts. These are like these existential doubts, right? Existential anxiety, right? What is life all about? What am I doing here? Where am I going? What is happening? Right? So these are all the things that we worry about so much. Yeah? So this is why I was mentioned before, this is no longer an ethical teaching. This is an existential teaching, right? These are the kind of doubts that bug you, right? Late at night, when everything is dark outside and you haven't got anything to distract yourself with anymore, okay? And you're left alone with your own thoughts and you're thinking, I have to get up and go to work in the morning, and what am I doing this for, and what is my life about, and and you lose hope. There's existential worries and despairs, right? So dependent origination addresses this, right? This is how we overcome these things, right? Because we understand this is what that process is, right? We look at our own experience. We begin with those things which everybody here can observe very simply in their own experience here and now. The eye and forms, ear and sounds, nose and taste, right? These senses, how these senses work, that's how consciousness works. Consciousness is nothing other than these energies, these patterns, right? This awareness shifting and changing, afflicted by conditions, afflicted by suffering, sometimes feeling pleasant, sometimes feeling pain, reacting and responding, and all of these things. We can see that happening right now in the present moment. And what happens when you get reborn is nothing different. That's the key. This is the key to dependent origination. Right? The process of rebirth, the whole process of samsara, is nothing other than what you are experiencing. The Buddha said that whenever anyone recollects their past lives and see how they were reborn, all they are recollecting is the 5 aggregates, the 5 khandhas: form, feeling, perception, intentions, consciousness. That's all there is. That's what you can experience in your awareness right now. And that's what rebirth consists of. Okay, and the Buddha then goes on to inquire this. He says, are you saying that out of respect for your teacher? They say no. Are you saying this because I've told you to say this? They say no. They say, why are you saying this? Because this is what we have known, seen and understood for ourselves. And the Buddha said, this is what I mean when I said that the Dhamma is visible here and now. Sanditiko, akaliko, ehipasiko, opanayiko, pachatam, veditabo, vinyuhi. And the Dhamma is visible here and now, immediately effective, inviting inspection, onward leading, to be experienced by the wise for themselves. Okay? That is what that Dhamma means. Yeah? And the Buddha goes on to talk about this, and there's a very interesting passage, the next one. And he talks about how rebirth takes place. Because the descent of the embryo, or the rebirth of the embryo, takes place through the union of 3 things. Here is the union of the mother and father, but the mother is not fertile, and the Gandhabba is not present. In this case, there is the embryo does not get reborn. Then there is the union of the mother and father. The mother is fertile, but the Gandhabba is not present. In this case too, there is no rebirth of the embryo, but when there is a mother and father, the mother is fertile and the Gandhabba is present. Through the union of these three things, the rebirth of the embryo takes place. So in this particular context, the word Gandhabba is used as a term for the consciousness which takes rebirth. So again, there's the idea that birth is conditioned and that there are multiple conditions, right? I talked before about the notion of Kamma, right? And how Kamma doesn't fix and determine everything, okay? So rebirth, yes, is conditioned by Kamma, but also there needs to be parents, right? I mean, it's not that you can have a certain Kamma and then you can sort of magically get reborn somewhere, right? There's a biological component as well, right? You have to have parents, they have to have intercourse, the mother has to be fertile, and so on and so forth. And if those biological conditions aren't met, the rebirth isn't going to happen, no matter what your Kamma might be, right? So the Kamma is not forcing those things, but the Kamma is directing the Gandhabba, or the consciousness, and making the rebirth possible. The Buddha then goes on. The mother then carries the embryo in her womb for 9 or 10 months with much anxiety as a heavy burden. At the end of the 9 or 10 months, the mother gives birth with much anxiety as a heavy burden. And I just once more just comment that as the Buddhist scriptures are one of the earliest places, if not the earliest places, where you find, and this is not the only place where you find this kind of sympathy for the special suffering that women have, especially with these process of giving birth and pregnancy, and that Buddha's compassion for understanding the suffering of that process. When the child is born, she nourishes the baby with her own blood, for the mother's breast milk is called blood in the Buddha's discipline. When the baby grows up and his faculties mature, the child plays at such games as toy ploughs, tipcat, somersaults, toy windmills, toy measures, toy cars, and a toy bow and arrow. Okay? Now, one of the things I find very astonishing about this particular passage is kids' games have not changed much, have they? Right? 2,500 years ago, and they're still playing exactly the same games that they're playing today, right? It's pretty amazing, isn't it, really? I mean, this is exactly the same thing. Even before the Buddha, if you look in the Indus Valley civilization, they also had toys which are very similar, like toy chariots and things like that. This is what the kids were playing with then, it's still what they play with today. So, here, again, we have to appreciate the context here, right? The Buddha's talking about child development, right? Talking about how infant development, the development of the child, affects us as we grow older, and how the experiences that we have, right, playing as a child, is leading to our maturity into growth. And the Buddha, as far as I'm aware, was the first person ever to talk about this process of infant development and child development, and how we become adults, and how this affects and conditions our life. So when he grows up, his faculties mature even further. The youth enjoys himself provided and endowed with the 5 types of sensual pleasure. And when he sees something with the eye, he lusts after it's pleasing or dislikes it if it's unpleasing. Abides with mindfulness of the body unestablished, with a limited mind, and does not understand as it really is freedom of the mind and freedom by wisdom, where these evil and wholesome dhammas cease without remainder. Engaged as he is in favouring and opposing whatever feeling he feels, whether pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, he delights in that feeling, welcomes it, and remains holding to it. As he does so, delight arising in him. Our delight in feelings is clinging. With clinging as condition, there is existence. With existence as condition, birth. With birth as condition, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair come to be. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. So of course this is how dependent origination is coming about. And similarly with experiencing through the different senses and so on. So here the Buddha is pointing to this whole problem, this whole existential problem that we're faced with of dukkha, and showing how it's emerging out of our biological experience of being born and growing up and so on. So this is our choice, right? So in that case, that's talking about the origin of suffering, and in that case, as one's growing up, one gets attached to things, follows on them, and then you make that karma which gets you reborn again and again and again. But that is our choice, and we don't have to choose that. We can choose to let go rather than choosing to follow and to get attached to things, getting caught up with karma, getting reborn again and again and again, we can make that choice to let go. So much happiness. Yeah, so easy to do. Letting go is the easiest thing in the world. Everyone thinks that letting go is hard. Letting go is so easy. You should try it sometime. Right? Pick something up. Oh, it's so hard. Heavy. Holding on is so hard. And then you let go. So easy. Goes. Don't have to worry. And so if you let go, this is the Buddha's promise. You let go a little bit. You let go of a little bit of suffering. You let go a medium amount of suffering goes. You let go completely. Suffering goes completely. And that process of karma, process of sankharas, that endless repeating of the patterns of birth, aging and death, the endless repeating of suffering, the endless repeating of getting hold of things, attaching to them, grabbing them, trying to hang on to them, only to lose them or to have them taken away from us, the grieving when the loved ones depart from us, and all of those things that we've been through so many times, and those things can all come to an end. And this is what the Buddha called Sambha Sankhara Samatha, the tranquilizing, the settling of all sankharas, all conditions, all processes, all energies, all become still. And so this is that escape from suffering. We look at those roots of karma: greed, hatred and delusion. Greed, hatred and delusion only lead to suffering, that's all. So sometimes we wonder, what is this? What is Nibbana? What is the ending of suffering like? What is it like if an Arahant dies? The Buddha said it's like a flame going out. Where does the flame go? We don't know where that flame goes. All we know is, as long as those roots of greed, hatred and delusion are there will be suffering. And when those roots are no longer there will no longer be suffering. And so this is the Buddha's promise. By letting go of these greed, hatred and delusion, we can let go of all suffering, make an end of all karma, and realize the real peace, which is Nibbana. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in these sessions, and hopefully we've had a chance to have a look at these different aspects of karma, how they work within the Buddha's teachings, how the teaching that leads to an ending of karma as well. And if this has helped us to understand the Buddha's teachings a little bit better, then that's a wonderful thing. But I hope that it can go beyond that, and I hope that it will encourage all of you to think about what we're doing in terms of making karma, how to make good karma, how to make better karma, and more importantly, most importantly of all, how to be able to practice the Eightfold Path for the letting go of all karma. So thank you very much.